Hi, today we're looking at photographing oystercatchers in flight. Now, I've done two difficult subjects in flight so far with this new camera, the Sony A1 and the 200 to 600 lens. I did missile thrush, which I've already posted onto YouTube, and since then I've done little L in flight as well. They're difficult because they're small birds and they're fast flying. And the little L was taken in heavy rain. It was so dull that I couldn't see the bird with my naked eye sitting on the branch next to its nest hole, and it was only when it launched into flight and I pressed the button on the camera it managed to autofocus on it, something that I could hardly see. Very impressive system for autofocus. Oystercatcher is a relatively easy subject. It's slow flying, it's bigger, and it's taken a very regular flight path as well. So it keeps crossing this causeway between these two lakes, and so long as I stand in the right place, I have to go back about 10 meters that way, it comes along the shoreline fairly consistently. If I go too far this direction, it starts to come around the back of me instead. So I've got to be in the perfect spot. When you're doing birds in flight, a good starting point is 2,500th of a second. I always tend to keep that figure in my head. Some birds you want a faster shutter speed and some a slow one. If you're doing a gannet in flight or a vulture that's just soaring, then you can have a much slower shutter speed. But a good starting point, 2,500th. Unfortunately, it's a bit dull today. In fact, it's just started to rain now, so I might have to come back. I really want brighter conditions than this, but I'm sure this camera will manage to lock onto it focus wise. I haven't got any extenders on. Doesn't matter whether you use the 1.4 or the 2 times extender, they both slow the autofocus down a little bit. Sometimes you've got no choice, you've got to have it on for birds in flight, but ideally you don't have any extenders on. Aperture wise, it's wide open, and at the moment I'm shooting on auto ISO. Never used auto ISO before, but I'm trying it with this camera, seeing if I can get used to it. After almost 50 years of doing aperture priority, throws your mind a bit when you do something different, but we'll see how we get on with auto ISO. The other advantage of this sight is I've got a green background. As long as the bird doesn't go too high, there's a slope behind me here and then some trees on top of it, so I'm not getting the sky. And today, with this horrible grey sky, I would have to start thinking about the exposure. So what we have here is a pair of oystercatchers on the left hand lake with some youngsters, and the adults are taken in turns. One of them stays with the young while the other flies across the causeway, across the right hand lake, disappears into the fields in the distance, collects some worms and flies back again. And it's going on all day for several days, and it gives you that opportunity of repeated action, which then you stand a chance of getting some flight pictures. Now here's a question for you. How many wader species feed their young? A friend posed this question to me when I mentioned I was filming oystercatchers, and I'd never thought about it before, but most wader species feed independently as soon as they come out the eggs. The only two we came up with of the British species are oystercatchers and stone curlew. The adult that stayed with the chicks was still feeding them, but the bird that flew off into the field further away would come back with larger worms. While I'm waiting for the opportunity to do the oystercatcher in flight, there was a few other things I could photograph. There's a pair of gadwall, male and female. Now I kept going back to this site several days, probably 6 or 7 mornings I was there, and at one point the female gadwall disappeared, and then the male was flying around from time to time. Presumably the female was on eggs somewhere. So there was opportunity to do flight shots of the male as he repeatedly looped around. Now this is taken with the Sony A1, the 200 to 600 lens, auto ISO, and the shutter speed set to 2,500th of a second, which should be very adequate for a duck in flight. And the ISO when it was sunny would be around 1,600. Also reed warbler, which very rarely show themselves completely. I had to manually focus here. I think it would be a bit much to expect the autofocus to cope through that vegetation. I've got the same problem today as I did with the little owl. I can't really see the oystercatcher coming. It comes over a ridge which is about 200 meters in that direction, and if the sun was shining I'd see the black and white of an oystercatcher coming over the ridge and against the grass bank, but in this dull light it doesn't show up. So I've missed it once, I didn't see it coming, so I've really got to pay attention. And what I've done is I've pre-focused the lens on the ground here about 70-80 meters away. So that's where I'm going to first put the bird into the viewfinder. So I want to be roughly focused at that point, and then the autofocus will lock on it, say, quite easily. It's important to be here early in the morning, here at 6 o'clock, and that's when the sun is low and it gets underneath the bird's wings. And by 9 o'clock, when it comes to birds in flight, it's all over. That's if the sun was shining. I got a feeling it's not going to today. It's not going to brighten up. I shall have to come back and do this again. But it's better when it's coming in this direction towards the chicks, because it's got worms in the bill. When it's flying that away, I get photographs as well, but this bill's empty, so it's more dramatic when it's got worms trailing out of the bill. Two pictures I took on that first day when it was rather dull. 2,500th of a second, wide open, with the ISO around 6,400. It's a great pity the sun is not shining this morning, because it would come up in the perfect direction. The sun would rise over there, so it lights up at the front of the bird as it comes across with the worms in its bill. It's just too dull. It wants some more sparkle in the light. It's all very well the autofocus working, but still the quality of the picture to think about. And the next day, with a bit of sun and very much the same activity, the birds were flying in exactly that same flight path. And when the bird is flying from right to left, then they tend to have a worm in the mouth, and when they're going left to right, they're going off to feed, so the beak is empty, and they do look more dramatic with a worm in the bill. Here the ISO is dropping down to around 1,600, still 2,500th of a second shutter speed. I was hand holding all the time. I will sometimes use a tripod for flight photography. I didn't attempt any video of the flying birds. I think it would be a little bit too fast for the autofocus in video mode, but it easily copes when you're taking stills pictures. For that Sony A1, this is a very simple subject to do. Thanks for watching.